So good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm Ben Murphy, and I work in the ATO's superannuation and employer obligations area. And for about the past 12 months, my job has been very heavily focused on the question of worker classification. So issues about whether someone is an employee or an independent contractor. The reason why it's the last 12 months will make sense very soon. I just wanted to start off by sort of setting the scene a little bit about what worker classification means for us in the ATO. So, obviously, the question of whether someone's an employee or a contractor has a lot of impacts in various things outside of tax and superannuation. But for us in the ATO, there is a whole raft of tax super reporting obligations that differ depending on whether a worker is an employee or a contractor. I've got some of them listed on the slide there. I'm not going to go through them all one by one, but what I did want to highlight was for a lot of them, there's sort of this clear divide. Someone's an employee, things are one way. Someone's a contractor, things are the other way. But the sort of the elephant in the room and the real exception to that is when it comes to superannuation, because of the extended definition of employee that's in the superannuation laws. And so the consequence of that is there are some independent contractors that you still need to make super contributions for. So we'll be touching on that as we look through some of the later content. So what I really want to talk about today is the past 12 months and what's happened. And so the reason this 12-month figure, I keep throwing it out there, worker classification has been an issue for decades, but about a year ago, a little over a year ago, there were these two landmark High Court decisions. It was the personnel contracting case, and then the other case was ZG Operations and Jamsec. Now, these two cases really did reshape our understanding of the law that applies when you're figuring out if a worker is an employee. And so for us, that's been the past 12 months has really been a big reaction to that. And so sort of immediately afterwards, we have a lot of legal documents out there that publish our view on how that law works. And so the main one was Taxation Ruling 2005 /16. That was our ruling that really outlined our law, our view of the law as to who's an employee. And there's a number of other products that do that as well. I've listed some of them on the slide there. And so essentially, the big task that I've been involved in the past however many months has been working through those and reformulating what our public statement is of our view of the law. And so the big milestone was late last year, just before Christmas, we published taxation ruling TR 2022 /D3. So the D, that's a draft product, so put out there for public comment. And that's really the replacement for that 2005 ruling. So that this new TR, the 2022, is the one with our new view of the law and how it works in light of these high court cases. Now, I believe you've already received some information on those cases in the past, so I'm not going to spend the whole time today talking about them. But I did want to highlight some of the key points, key takeaways from them, and particularly the big things that have changed, so that you have a bit of insight as to what's in our actual ruling that we've put out there. So when it comes to the cases, and really mainly the personnel contracting case, that's the one where a lot of the principles are set down. I'd say there's really three key takeaways. And from that, there was two things that really represent a shift from our traditional thinking of the tests that you use to establish whether or not a worker is an employee. So the first of those is the evidence that you're allowed to rely on in answering this question of what the worker's classification is. So previously, our understanding of the law, as was a lot of other people's, was we would look at everything under the sun. So we would look at all of the contracts and other documentation between a worker and a business, and then we'd also look at all of the the way that things played out in practice and sort of how things worked day to day. Any other evidence about, how that relationship really existed throughout its life. And we'd bring all of that together and sort of, it was called this multifactorial test, where we'd bring all of that together and look at this totality of the relationship. And what the court said on this point was, ultimately, the question of whether someone's an employee or not is a legal question. And following on from that, the evidence that you should look at when you're making that decision should just be the legal rights and obligations that exist between these parties. So, in other words, the contractual terms and conditions that exist between these parties. And so you can see that's obviously a big departure from what I said about the old ways, where we would just look at absolutely everything under the sun. But what I want to, I guess, clarify about that, or shed a bit more light, is it's perhaps not as cut and dry as you might initially think, or as maybe you've seen from some articles about this that came out shortly after the decision. Because it's true that it will only be the legal rights and obligations. But what's not always true is that all of those legal rights and obligations will be found in the piece of paper that the two parties signed. So if you've got a written contract there, that's obviously a great starting point for establishing what the legal rights and obligations were. And in the cases themselves, that was really the main focal point. But it's not always going to be the case that that is where you find all of those legal rights and obligations. And the court did acknowledge that in those judgments. They acknowledged situations in which that might not be the case, and you will need to look at evidence other than the piece of paper. So a very common example of that might be where a contract was entered into, but then it's been varied. So, for example, the worker in the business signed a document that says X, Y, and Z, and then a couple of years later, there's a significant change in the business, and the business starts imposing new obligations that the worker has to abide by, and the worker accepts all of that and abides by it. That can amount to a variation of the contract, even if there's no new document written up and signed. And what that means for this question of whether they're an employee or not is, from that point, you need to be looking at the varied contract and the new set of legal rights and obligations that exist once that variation has taken place. And so the piece of paper that you had when they first signed it's no longer the be-all end-all of the evidence that you've got here. So what that really means for us, I think, is the other big thing. So, our role in this is investigator, if you like, or we're auditing someone. We need to establish how the law actually applies to that relationship. And so what that means for us is we are still going to need to look at everything. We might not use it all ultimately, but we are going to need to go out there and gather all that evidence about how the relationship played out in practice and what actually ultimately happened between the parties to figure out if a written contract is the source of all the legal rights and obligations, or if there's other things that factor in. So, for example, was there a variation? Were there additional terms that were agreed to verbally beyond what's in the piece of paper? These kinds of things. So we will still gather all of this evidence, and if someone has the good fortune of being audited, they may, they'll still see the ATO asking for all of this information. And so it doesn't mean we're going to end up using it all. The thing that's really different for us on our side is this sort of additional step that's now in there, where we will need to whittle down from all of the evidence that we've gathered to get down to what is actually the set of legal rights and obligations. And once we've narrowed in on that, that's what we'll actually rely on when we're making our decision. All the other evidence we'll set to one side. We're not going to use it. That's sort of, it's a bit more tricky than some of the stuff I've seen where it's been suggested that as soon as you've got a written document, you're all sweet and you don't need to worry about anything else. The document's the only thing that's ever going to get looked at, because that's just not the case. And the court acknowledged that wasn't the case. So that's the first thing that changed in these court cases. The second thing's probably a bit more subtle, but if you've dealt in this space before, you're no doubt aware of sort of the traditional set of indicia that you'd look at to have the characteristics of being an employee or not being one. And it's things like control, how integrated they are into the business, whether they can delegate, whether there's provision of tools and equipment. These classic indicia. What we would usually do in the past is we'd work through all of these. We'd work through them all diligently, one by one, get the evidence, get a feel for each one of them, and then ultimately just sort of step back, bring all of that together, and form it together to make an overarching judgment about whether we felt like it ultimately fell on one side of the fence or the other. And the court was a bit critical of that kind of approach. They said that's not really the best way to be going about this. And what they said was, the guiding sort of focusing question that should really be answered here at the end of the day is whether this worker is serving in the business of the possible employer. So, or if they're not serving in that business, it could be, for example, because they're running a business of their own and what they're doing is serving their own business. So you still have those indicia, you still have control, you still have delegation, that sort of thing. But they're not just things in a vacuum to tick off one way or the other. What they're really there for is to help you answer that question of whether they're in the business. And so a lack of control, the worker having their own autonomy to be doing all kinds of other activities, is consistent with them having their own business out there, having their own workforce that they're delegating to. Again, that's them having their own business out there that's doing its own thing. It's not consistent with them being in the business of the possible employer. So again, at the end of the day, you're still looking at the same tests, the same indicia. It's really more about how you focus that all together. Now, I said three things, and the third thing is one that in our minds has definitely not changed. This is something that we've always been maintaining as the correct view of the law, but very good to get clarification from this case. I said what matters is the contract, and the contractual terms and conditions, and that's true. But it's important to remember that it is actually the substantive rights and obligations in that contract. So it's what did the contract actually create between the parties. What's less important is the labels that they use to describe themselves, or the language that they use to describe themselves in the contract. So, in the personnel contracting case, the worker, who was ultimately found to be an employee, they were called independent contractor and self-employed contractor in the document, but that didn't hold sway. At the end of the day, what the contract actually did was create an employment relationship. The terms and conditions in there and the things that it legally created were consistent with employment. So it doesn't matter that they called them an independent contractor. It doesn't matter that they showed that that's what they wanted it to be. And so to take an example of what wouldn't work, if you grabbed a standard form template contract that is used for creating employment, so an employment contract, and you went in and did a find and replace on all of the employee terms and replaced them with independent contractor, you wouldn't end up with an independent contractor contract. It's still going to be a contract that makes an employment relationship, because it wasn't the labels that mattered, it was what that contract actually did legally. So that's, in a nutshell, the High Court. And if you look at our draft tax ruling, you'll sort of see how we've reflected those principles in there and sort of factored that into our overall view of how this law all works. So as I said, it was released for draft. The comments period closed sort of late February, and so we're now in that stage of working through all the submissions that we received during that consultation period and working towards a final product. So before I move on from this slide, I do want to note, just to put a pin in for later, in the future part of this slide is an SG ruling, which is sort of the sister product to the old tax ruling. It deals with the superannuation side of things, and so importantly there, it deals with that extended definition that I was talking about. I'll come back to that later. But what I want to talk about next is I mentioned that we released this tax ruling in December, but the other thing that we actually released alongside it was a practical compliance guideline, or a PCG. That's number 2022/D5. So I'm not sure, those of you out there, if you've had much dealings with any of the ATO's PCGs in the recent past. It's something that we're doing, I guess, more and more of, and a big focus for us. But a PCG essentially puts out there for the public our approach to where we're going to apply our compliance resources. So you got something like a ruling, which is our view of the law, and that's how the law works. And if we audit you, that's the law that we're going to follow. But it's equally relevant to know where we're actually going to audit, where we're going to apply our compliance resources. What sort of cases are we bringing forward? What sort of cases are we less concerned about and not going to pursue? And we've found that by publicly communicating that approach, up front and clearly, it provides that added degree of sort of helpful guidance and certainty for taxpayers out there. And so that's what we're looking to do in this employee contractor space as well. And so in this PCG, what we've set out to do is really put a kind of a risk framework around arrangements where businesses have engaged workers. And so you can see on the slide there that we've got 4 risk zones. So very low, low, medium, and high. And there's certain criteria that you need to hit to get into those zones. And if you get in the better zones, in particular at the top and very low, you can have the certainty that that's not a case that we're actually going to take further into audit. And conversely, if you're in the red zone, you'd be very sure that's where we're going to be taking a look, and we're going to be scrutinizing whether you've gotten that classification correct. Now, I think this is really important in this worker classification space because, as I hope you know from what I was talking about in the previous slide, this is a hard area of the law, and it's an area of the law that relies a lot on the real specific evidence of what happened and the real, fine print and finer details of the contracts that you might have with a business and a worker. And so it can be hard to get certainty and really be 100% sure that the classification that you've landed on is the right one. And even if both the business and the worker agree that it should be one way, even if they're both saying, yeah, this is independent contracting, it's not employment, the fact is that could be wrong. They could have gotten it wrong. And so what we're hoping to do here is give an opportunity to get a bit more comfort, at least as far as the ATO is concerned, about what we're going to focus on. And if you're in the right zone, you can have that level of surety that we're not going to be knocking. So if you have a look at that PCG, what you'll probably notice is there's no mention of control, delegation, or risk, or provision of tools, or any of that legal stuff that I was talking about in the previous slide. It's not in there at all, and it doesn't form part of what gets you into one of these zones or not. And that's very deliberate because, as I said, the law is the law, and it's a very fact-specific thing to deal with. What we're focused on here in terms of our assessment of the risk is, I'd sort of describe it as the due diligence that the parties undertook, or the good governance, particularly from the business who's engaging a worker. And so it's things like, do they actually have a contract there where you can see that they agreed that it was supposed to be classified the way that they say it was? Is there evidence that they actually had a discussion about that the worker understands what's going on, and why they're, for example, why they're saying that they're an independent contractor? Have things deviated from what was agreed to? And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that if things have changed a lot from what was originally signed on a piece of paper, you could have a variation of the contract, and the actual situation could be different from what you think you had originally. And so that obviously increases the risk there if things have deviated significantly. And then the next one I got on the slide there is probably the one that's had the most feedback, which is about obtaining advice, professional advice on the arrangements. Now, um, we understand obviously that is perhaps not something that is commonly done a lot, and that there's a cost associated with it, depending on how you want to get that advice. What we'd say is this PCG is going to be most relevant in the situations where uh, the arrangement isn't certain. There's arrangements that are going to be extremely obvious that it was an employee. You're not going to care about this PCG because you know what the answer is and you can just go with it. There'll be arrangements where it's extremely obvious that it was a contractor. But what really matters is the ones where you can't be 100% sure. You're not quite there. You're uncomfortable about it. And we think it's reasonable that in those situations, if you want to enjoy this sort of added layer of protection, that you have taken those steps to try and get that clarity, get that confirmation from someone who has the expertise on these topics. And so I think that's a decent point to highlight that, to be frank, this isn't a PCG where we're expecting that it gets published and on day one everyone's in very low. It's a fact of life that businesses, when they've engaged workers in the past, they may not have done a lot of these things. They may have left it a little bit more up in the air. They may have been less consciously focused on having good evidence around the way that they classified these workers. What this is, this is a document that's really more about the future than the past. And it's what we'd say is it's really sort of creating a roadmap of what we say would be good practice or best practice when you're engaging workers to make sure you're getting the classification right and that's all clear. And if you follow that roadmap, well, you have the added benefit of enjoying this new layer of protection that you can obtain from this PCG. Failing to get into very low or low doesn't mean you've definitely gotten it wrong. It just means that you won't be spared an audit if an audit comes your way. So I'm aware, maybe to put this in a bit more context, I'm aware in the electricians industry that a common situation might be that someone's working for you as an employee, and then as they become more experienced, they want to branch out themselves and start being self-employed and running their own business, and still they'll still work for you, but they just want to come back to you as a contractor, no longer be employed. And so that's I think a perfect example of where this kind of approach is relevant. It's a clear tipping point when the arrangement is changing, and you've got the opportunity there to follow these steps and make sure that things are all dealt with well and dealt with transparently with the worker, and it's very clear what's happening, and you do it at that point in time, and it's all set up, and then as long as nothing changes significantly, you'll be in the position to enjoy that greater degree of protection when it comes to the ATO's approach to things. So, as I said, like the TR, this document was put out in December for comments, and the comments closed at the same time. So we're also working through the feedback from that and moving that towards finalization. For both products, I'd roughly estimate that they're likely to be published sometime around mid-year. So if those two products are really, if what I've been talking about is mostly about the question of whether someone's an employee or a contractor, what I wanted to focus on for the rest of the time was about that extended definition for superannuation purposes. So I'll preface this by saying that at the time of this recording, there's been another court case that has just been handed down. And so I won't be talking about that today, but certainly something to be aware of. You'll probably hear more about in the near future. And that is actually the JAMSEC case. So I mentioned that the ZG operations, and JAMSEC was one of the cases before the High Court last year. Well, the High Court decided the question of whether the workers in that case, they were truck drivers, whether they were employees or contractors. They found that they were contractors, but they didn't decide the application of this extended definition. They sent that back down to the full federal court, and it's that decision there that's just landed. So I might just pause there and go back to rewind a bit to this what I mean when I say this extended definition. So the Super Guarantee Admin Act has an extended definition of employee for the purposes of that act, and there's a range of categories in there that bring someone into the veil of being an employee. Now, a lot of them are quite niche. The one that I really am focusing on when I'm talking about this is the one that's in subsection 12.3, and that provision, that category of this extension, what it says is that someone who works under a contract that's wholly or principally for their labour is an employee of the other party to that contract. So it's definitely capturing people who are independent contractors, so long as their contract is one that's at least principally for their labour. Now, what I will start with is actually on the right side of this slide, which is a case that was handed down a couple of years ago, the Moffat case, which is about a dentist. And in that case, the court really split that provision that I just described into three elements. I mean, they really just split the sentence up, but they said, firstly, there must be a contract. Secondly, that contract must be wholly or principally for the worker's labour. And then third, the worker needs to work under that contract. So most of the time, the first and third parts of that are going to be pretty straightforward to identify. The real juicy one's that middle one, finding out what the contract is for. So you got a contract, what's it for? And what the court said on that front is, when you're asking what it's for, you're putting yourself in the shoes of the business, the one who's engaging the worker. What's it for them? So in other words, what are they getting out of the contract? What's the benefit that the contract is providing them? It's not really about what they're giving to the worker, generally money. What it's about is what they're actually getting back from the worker. And if what they're getting back is labour, the performance of some sort of labour, well, that's the kind of contract that satisfies this extended definition. That's the kind of worker who gets super, regardless of whether they're an employee. So I mentioned this SG ruling, 2005/1. So picking that back up, essentially the reason that one is perhaps a bit behind the tax ruling is because of that Jamset case. So the Jamset case is sort of the last domino to fall for us to then go and review that ruling and make whatever changes we need to make to update it and make sure it's current with the more recent court developments. But what that ruling says about this extended definition is, I'd say, it's certainly still our current view of the law, and it is, I suggest it's not going to get completely flipped on its head. The three tests that we outline in that ruling remain relevant, and so they're on the left side of this slide. So I wanted to go through each of them a little bit, probably mostly the last two. So firstly, we ask whether the worker is getting remunerated principally for labour or skills. And what this is really asking is, you have a lot of contracts where there's labour and there's equipment, maybe there's materials, maybe there's bringing some sort of asset. If you've got these different components in a contract, is labour the principal thing? And we have a very old SG determination where we essentially say principal will be if you look at the values, market values of those different things, and it's the labour is worth more than half, that'll be enough and be principally for labour. So you might have a contract where the thing that they're providing involves 60% labour, 40% equipment. That's the kind of thing that will pass this test. So the next two, though, are really probably the more contentious ones, or the ones that we have a lot more dealings with. And the first of that is what's often called the so-called delegation test. What the ruling really asks is whether the worker is the one that needs to actually perform the services that the contract is concerned with. So the reason this is important is when I was describing the test or the provision just before, um, I noted it needs to be for that worker's labour. So it's not enough for it to be for labour if it's anyone's labour, if it's someone else's labour, not the workers themselves. And that's why if you have a arrangement, for example, where the worker is completely free to delegate to anyone else, and the contract doesn't care who actually performs these services as long as they get done, and they can, have an army of people at their disposal. Even though that might be labor, it's not going to be the worker's labor, and so it's going to fall out of this test. But there is, I suppose, a more recent caveat to that I might highlight, which is from a case last year that we were involved in, the JMC case. This was about a lecturer in a tertiary education provider. And so the court in that case noted that if you have a right to delegate, but it's very limited and narrow, and there's a lot of restrictions around how delegation can occur, when it can occur, who it can occur to, you might still not say a contract's wholly for the worker's labour. There is the potential for someone else to be doing the work, so it can't be wholly their labour, but it could still be principally for their labour. And the court used words like if the predominant purpose of the contract was still for that worker to do the work, or if the default position was for that worker to do the work. Again, maybe not wholly if someone else could do it a bit, but still principally. I do note though, maybe take that note on caution, because that JMC case is subject to appeal. Probably sometime later this year, and so we'll obviously wait and see what an appeals court says about that case. The last one on here, and this is probably the big one, and the one that I think people are most interested in, which is the question of whether a contract is for a result, the so-called results test. And so I think following the Moffat case, there's been quite a bit of uncertainty in the market about whether this test is still good, whether it's still good law, whether the ATO still believes in it. And the short answer is yes, it is still a valid test. The cases that previously raised it are still good law. Just because the Moffat case didn't use the R word in it doesn't mean it completely invalidates the existence of that test. But what I want to highlight here is that it's really quite a difficult test to apply, and there's a lot of perhaps nuance to how you figure out if a contract is actually for result, or whether it's for the labour that creates that result. And the courts have acknowledged that can be a pretty fine distinction there. So is the contract for the labour, or is it for the thing that you get from the labour? Can be a very fine line. So I suppose a couple of key messages, or just takeaways on that point to think about. If you have a contract where there is a big end thing for the contract, and I'll use a very simplistic example. If I hire someone to come and fix my roof, the thing that the contract is for is fixing the roof. And when the roof is fixed, that's the completion of the contract. That's the thing that triggers the remuneration, triggers me paying the guy. Now, that sort of thing is almost certainly going to be for result, even if the way that the amount of payments been calculated, negotiated, quoted, is based on a sort of an estimated hours that it's going to take to complete it. So, what is really important there is that there is a result that you can point to and say that result was what the contract was for. At the other end of the spectrum, I suppose a trap that I've seen people fall into quite a lot is just because someone is paid in a way that's not hourly doesn't mean a contract's definitely for result. And so, classic example is you see a lot of contracts where people get, piece rate pay, or they get paid, per completed task, or they get paid commissions. These sort of things where the amount that they're going to get paid is, goes up and down depending on how much they do, rather than how long they work. And it's it's simply not the case that having that kind of remuneration equals results contract. And the courts have found many times over the years that you can have that kind of payment structure and still have a contract that's for someone's labor. So the delivery person who gets paid per completed delivery doesn't mean it's necessarily for result. It could still be for the labor being the performance of those deliveries. So that's really seeing those two sides of the two ends of the spectrum. The thing that I see a lot is people just base their answer to this question solely on, is this being done hourly or is this being done some other way? And you really got to look past that and look at what the contract is actually there for. Now, perhaps this isn't very helpful, but contracts are far more likely to be for results if the thing that's being provided is some task that requires a lot more than just labor, or a lot more than just one person's labor. So if I commission someone to build a house, and it's going to have multiple people working, there's huge machinery costs and materials costs and et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, you can't point to the specific performance of labor within what's going to happen and say that's what the contract's for. It's for the big results of that's all going to achieve. The reason that's perhaps not helpful is what that usually means is the kind of contracts that fall out are the kinds that would have fallen out due to one of those other tests anyway. But when it comes to a contract that's not going to fall out of those other two tests, I'd say that the real takeaway is to just look closely at what the contract is actually providing for the business. If it's ongoing general services, it's pretty unlikely that it's going to be a results contract. If it's a one and done, doing a job contract where you contract them to come and do one thing and you're going to pay them for that one thing when that thing is completed, and if it's not completed to the standard you want, you don't have to pay them. I mean, that's far more likely to be something that's a results contract. So again, it's a bit of a fine line, but I suppose the other takeaway I would leave there is obviously to stay tuned with our SG ruling, and once we get through the review and revisions of that, I'm hoping we'll have some more helpful guidance, fresher guidance out there on these topics. I should say as well, the PCG, just for completeness, the PCG I was talking about, it is relevant for this extended definition. It is relevant for superannuation, as well as the other impacts of being an employee. So I guess if you're wrestling with these tests here, and you think it's difficult to get a really clear picture, all the more reason to consider that PCG and whether you have the ability to take the right steps to fall in one of those more favourable risk zones. So I'm going to wrap it up there with what I wanted to say. I guess I will leave you with that to digest. And thank you all very much for your time today. I really appreciate the chance to come and speak with you all. So thank you.